One of my first gaming videos on this channel was on Kirby Super Star and its remake, and there I briefly mentioned that Spring Breeze was a remake of the first Kirby game, and after a long time it feels nice to go back and wrap up that video properly by actually talking about Kirby's Dream Land, Kirby's debut on the Game Boy, and Masahiro Sakurai's directorial debut. Since its release, it's reappeared on the Wii and Kirby's Dream Collection, the 3DS Virtual Console, and as of yesterday, at the time of this writing, Switch's online service. Dreamland was designed to be accessible, and that may have contributed to the extremely strong sales and the launching of this whole thing into a franchise. Also yes, the Western box art makes Kirby white. I assume like Angry Brow's Kirby, this was to make him seem cooler rather than adorable to audiences that cared more about that in the West. I'm not gonna lie, Dreamland feels very rough to play. Its most notable difference from the rest of the series is that it lacks copy abilities. This makes the game very, very odd. While Kirby can damage most regular enemies with the air puffs he lets out when deflating, bosses are completely immune to this, which puts Kirby into the very strange position of being almost entirely reactive. Your primary mode of attack is to swallow and spit, wait for openings, grab whatever the boss or enemy gives you, launch, and repeat. The game can actually get fairly tedious for it. You're entirely at the mercy of enemies and bosses to give you the ability to harm them, and this can result in extremely long gaps of dodging about and waiting. I think the game manages to make it at least usually interesting, and it definitely forces you to actually memorize and engage with the bosses beyond bringing a useful ability in. Although it's not the only issue I have. The game is generally a bit stiff and clunky too. The inhale is the worst, taking a pretty substantial time to start up and end, it feels like almost an entire second, and leaving you largely vulnerable while doing it, especially against bosses. Other odd movement quirks are present too. Even after swallowing, there's moderate delay before you can act. The bounce when you land launches Kirby a substantial amount while completely vulnerable. Inhaling an enemy makes Kirby's hitbox so substantially larger that it makes him really unwieldy, especially against bosses, and Kirby just generally feels a little bit sluggish. I may come off a bit harsh, but there's a lot to appreciate too. The gameplay is fun at its core. Sucking up enemies and lining up good shots is really satisfying, more so than using powers can be at times. The puff-up is a genius way to relieve the pressure of the platforming, as well as to add verticality, and for a game that's hardly 30 minutes long, it manages a huge chunk of variety. Whether that's in maze-like levels, neat power-ups like the Curry, which lets Kirby shoot fireballs briefly, essentially a small dip into what the copy abilities would do later, and they even sneak in a brief shoot-'em-up section. Will never be my favorite Kirby game, it's really solid and admirably offers the most challenge the series has ever seen with how much it forces you to properly engage with the fights. Although it also highlights how much variety copy abilities add to the game. Before I move on, it's worth noting that this game lacks any save features, probably a cost-saving measure, but it doesn't really matter when the game itself is 30 minutes long and decently easy. The game also has a surprisingly inconsistent performance. It's usually fine, but as enemies start spamming more and more projectiles, or is more generally on screen, especially in the extra game, the game will slow down harshly, running in slow motion until stuff starts leaving the screen. This also sometimes causes some fairly severe sprite flickering, especially in the short shoot-'em-up segment, which can make dodging attacks there very difficult. I think it's rare enough that it stands out really badly when it does happen, but also not enough that it's a persistent issue. It's incredible how early Kirby established itself musically. Almost every song in this game has become a staple of the franchise, like Green Green's and Dedede's theme, but also sets the stage for the general style of these laid-back, bubbly themes and the contrast to these hard-hitting action themes for big moments that define the series. Dreamland falls somewhere on the upper middle of Gameboy visually. The art design is fantastic, and everything in the game, Kirby enemy bosses, are all wonderful, adorable, classic designs, but animation is a little slim in this game. Kirby's inflated walking animation is very truncated and looks a little goofy, although I think bosses especially have just fantastic huge sprites, or even if their animation is still a bit jerky, they're very well realized and detailed sprites that give the whole game a perfect, soft style that characterizes the series very well, and captures the style of the artwork for the series very nicely as well. As I mentioned before, Dreamland is genuinely a 30-minute game. There's not a lot of content, but it's generally all solid, with a lot of ideas crammed in rapid fire. I've roughly covered most of what the game has to offer in the Superstar video, although generally, Superstar condensed many stage elements and even skipped segments entirely. Green Green's is roughly the same, with only some minor tweaks. The most apparent thing you'd notice is how much not having abilities interrupts the flow of the game at times. And like obviously any Kirby game can be beaten this way, but even Wispy is a lot more difficult when you're on the back foot and having to wait to attack reactively. Castle Lololo is unique for having been skipped entirely in Superstar. In fact, it's largely been ignored for the whole series, despite fairly frequent references to the other Dreamland areas. I imagine it was to some extent skipped in Superstar for being pretty complex, featuring sort of maze-like rooms with multiple exits, some optional rooms, shortcuts, and also introducing some of the power-ups. Curry to blast through some blocks, the mic to nuke the screen. Thematically, the stage is just kind of a castle, which makes sense since Lololo and Lololo, who are semi-legacy characters from HAL's earlier Adventures of Lolo and Lala series, although it's not the most exciting location in the game. The Lololo mini-boss is a bit unique as he tosses blocks from random holes, making it a sort of whack-a-mole situation. While the actual fight against Lololo and Lololo did survive the level's removal and ended up in Float Island, being virtually unchanged with their pushing blocks back and forth thing. The Superstar version of Float Islands does transition into a very miniaturized version of Castle Lololo, but that also comes at the cost of a lot of the content in Float Islands. Speaking of Float Islands, there's a lot of stuff that was chopped out. Really, the entire second half of level with the pirate ship thing is kind of just unceremoniously dropped, as is the wacky cutscene with the whale, which is one of the things I love in this game, all the little cutscenes scattered about, as well as the entire boss stage, Kabula, the shoot 'em up segment, which is not great with sluggish control and with so much sprite flicker on its projectiles that it becomes very hard to dodge. Although it's cool that Kabula would later be repurposed for Superstar Ultra. Bubbly Clouds is perhaps the least changed stage besides Green Greens. It's full of the same giant pits, walls of blocks, and Kracko and Kracko Jr., only really skipping a short gimmick section with the curry. The cloud theming is cute and I love the music, plus Kracko and Kracko Jr. are fantastic bosses, even if you can kind of cheese both by standing at the bottom left where they're pretty much incapable of hitting you. Although about here I started to notice that the game is a little stingy with healing. This game is fairly easy, but hits start to add up, and you'll probably die every once in a while simply because most stages have next to no food to heal off of. It's not a big deal, just kind of something I noticed. Dedede's castle is a boss rush. There's briefly remixed levels before each fight, but it's just fighting all 4 bosses again, which feels a little, I don't know. I mean, the game is 30 minutes long, so having blatant padding is kind of silly. Dedede is actually pretty formidable here. Unlike in this game's soft remake from Superstar, his pratfall and suction attacks come out very quickly, and neither of these attacks generate stars. While his hammer attack and jump are the only 2 that do, he kills Kirby in 6 hits or touches, and he's rather fast. He rarely chooses to use his hammer, so you can often be caught in a loop of dodging for 20 or 30 solid seconds before you're given even a slight opportunity to attack him. And the stars dissipate really quickly, so it's kind of hard to grab them before they go, which makes the fight rather tedious if not outright frustrating, especially when Kirby's hitbox grows greatly when you suck up stars, which can sometimes cause him to get cheap hits on you. And with the suction being so punishable, there's a lot of times where you end up just taking hits regardless when you do the right thing because fuck you, I guess. It's intense, but it can also kind of feel like it's pretty stacked against you and really highlights how little agency you have when the ability to play aggressively is taken from you, especially if you get stuck in a bad loop of 30-second dodges before you get one attack. Kirby's Dream Land also features an extra mode, which is basically a hard mode version of the game. I'm not quite sure how I feel about it, to be quite honest. Levels themselves maintain their layouts, although enemies are far more numerous, move faster, and a few are replaced by similar but stronger enemies that deal 2 or more damage, and may have more complicated patterns. To that end, some of the additions are really funny, like the umbrellas Waddle Dee sometimes float down on becoming homing missiles that chase you down, but largely the game feels identical but a little more obnoxious. Things come at you fast and often, and it feels like you just gotta know what's coming, especially because the screen is so small. And the general lack of healing items throughout the game makes it a little more frustrating than anything. Bosses are kind of a mixed bag. They all kind of feel like fighting game bosses now, goofy a comparison as that sounds. They all seem to move at roughly 1.25 times speed at all times, but also just act faster out of their previous moves. A few have some new stuff tacked on. Wispy drops Gordos along with apples. Kracko directly charges the player and can actually hit the corner, requiring you to occasionally do jumps, as well as replacing the wall deuce he spit out before, with bombs that explode when they touch the ground, requiring a bit more focus to be able to damage him. But most are just a touch annoying. It's mostly unfair as a comparison for obvious reasons, but Revenge of the King and Superstar Ultra added some kind of full mix-up and several moves to each fight. Well, here, besides the Krackos, the fights are essentially the same as they were before, but in fast forward. And this makes Dedede incredibly miserable. He can and will act directly out of his jump attack to surprise you, jumps substantially more, outruns you, and is a never-ending barrage of shit that took me 2 hours and tempted me hard to give up. Kirby's inherent disadvantage of being reactive is turned up to 11, and the lagginess of his suction attack makes even attempting tempting to go for a damage a coin flip. So harsh that the battle feels more luck than skill. Extra mode is kinda neat for introducing new elements, especially on Krakow, but it genuinely doesn't feel very good to play, since it's so heavily based around punishing Kirby for being slow by making everything so fast. It's more interesting for inspiring better challenge modes in the future, like the arena. It's also kinda notable that this game has a full sound test hidden in it. It's not that special as far as the Kirby series goes, but it would go on to be another, like, early series staple that would continue to appear in basically every game. Kirby's Dream Land is okay. It has a lot of charm in the music and its general art style and a lot of visual variety, but it's really rough around every edge. It's a good base for the series, but extremely stiff controls, weak gameplay variety without copy abilities, and a good helping and jank everywhere make it feel like a prototype more than anything. It's an impressive one that heavily laid the groundwork for its sequels, but one that's not all that fun to return to. Even the more interesting aspects of it, like extra mode, are kind of poorly balanced and frustrating, and, you know, the levels, well, mostly interesting and unique from each other, all kind of feel a little rough around the edges. Kirby's very clunky to control and stiff and awkward and laggy, and, you know, the copy abilities are missing, and those are always like a big highlight of the replayability, and to try different abilities and this and that and all that kind of stuff, especially when compared to its... In the end, it's just kind of a game that feels a little dated in the wrong ways. A little clunky, especially given how smooth most of the other Kirby games play, and like especially compared to its much more polished remakes on Superstar and Superstar Ultra. Kirby's Dream Land is just kind of hard to go back to, in my opinion.